right. Thank you very much for coming to hear about some of the many exciting things that are going to affect the way you shop and eat and cook in the future. This presentation could be about 3 days long. So there's probably going to be things that you're like, why didn't she mention? And truthfully, I just picked out the things that I think will have impact, that will affect people in the food manufacturing business and consumers in a really profound way. I'm very kind of free range, and don't worry, don't duck down, it's fine. If you have questions, I'd prefer us to wait till near the end, but if it's a clarification question or something, just put your hand up. I have a colleague here who has a microphone, so if you feel like you need to kind of project, he can always pass that along to you, and we can kind of go from there. So without further ado, my name's Dana McCauley. If you think you are in Macrame 101, you're in the wrong room. And we're going to start talking about the future of food. Here's a picture of me when I had professional hair, makeup, lighting, and photography. So if you don't recognize me, that's fine. But just a little bit about me. You can find me on social media. I share a lot about food trends and new emerging science in the agri-food sector on my Twitter. If you follow me on Instagram, you better like dogs, because I use that for a much more personal usage. So you're very aware, I'm sure, of walking the show and seeing the Innovation Award winners that we distinguished yesterday, that meatless, plant-based, big thrust in the marketplace right now. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the highlights of this trend and what's kind of happening behind the scenes in labs, so you have a sense of some of the technology that's affecting the space. So this is a restaurant that's not far from here. It's called Planta. It's at Bay and Bloor, and it's operated by two chefs who distinguish themselves in non-vegetarian categories, and their success is really interesting because it really mirrors how the meatless trend has evolved in Canada. So David Lee is the most involved partner, and he won gold medal plates about 7-8 years ago. It's one of the big Canadian culinary championships with a fried chicken skin dish that he made. So it included cartilage, etc. So really not the guy you thought was going to become the owner of an empire of vegetarian restaurants. But that's exactly what's happened. And he's in fact closed his fine dining restaurant and turned it into a Planta. His partner, Andrew Chase, next to his restaurant, The Chase, there's now a Planta Express. So you really see that the momentum around meatless in urban centers in particular is quite high. A lot of the marketing behind things like Meatless Monday, et cetera, have extended this target market to be people who are still eating meat, maybe have leather shoes on and leather furniture in their homes. And that's why you'll be hearing the term plant-based so often, because we really do have two different segments in that market. We've got your traditional vegans who have a lot of compassionate reasons for their dietary choices and ethical reasons. And then the plant-based folks who often are just trying to eat less meat. And that's why you see all these knockoff meats like this. I don't think you can turn on the TV or the radio and not hear about Beyond Meat this week and last week. They are filing apparently for an IPO that'll be worth $1 billion. They now have distribution across food service and are just launching with Sobeys nationally. Definitely an interesting story. What's coming up behind them are a lot of items like this crispy shrimp. The New Wave Foods is this plant-based seafood analog company. They use a lot of algae and other natural products to duplicate the texture, taste, and look of seafood products. And there's a lot of really interesting discussion going on, certainly on my Twitter and in boardrooms and among policymakers, about whether or not calling something like this meat or shrimp is the appropriate way to be labeling. I have, that could be another seminar about whether or not you listen to demand and speak to consumers in a language that they can relate to, or whether or not we have to get, like really, really into the weeds and tell people exactly what something is. But that's a topic that will resolve itself with lots of gnarly side conversations. The whole idea of motherless meat, and I've been struggling with what to call this. So for a while, I was calling it lab-grown meat, and people thought that was kind of gross. But basically, the science here is that you take cells from a living animal and then you grow them in a lab environment. So there's no animal ethics issues around developing these proteins and these liquids, and they're bioidentical and nutritionally identical to what would come out of a cow, a steer, etc. It requires a lot of very complex science. Right now, we are still quite far from this having commercial opportunity. I read an article last week that said that at this point, with the science that's in place and the capacity that's in place, that a cellular burger would cost about $50 a patty. So needless to say, that's... You anticipated my next remark. I remember when I first heard about this science, it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and it was like, it cost them $1 million to make this meatball. And I was, yeah, so exactly. And so it will come to pass. But there are, of course, a lot of, this makes it even more complicated to how to label this. And certainly with, seeing the opportunity of things like the Beyond Meat Burger, they're getting market validation on a daily basis. So this is a slide. I'm going to be making a PDF version of this presentation available. I'm not going to get into the weeds about the science, but for those who do want to know how it really works, here you go. And if you want to talk to someone about this, Dr. Mario Maragoni, who I work with at the University of Guelph, he is right now trying to duplicate the texture of steak using a similar method, and he's already developed apparently a vegan cheese that has a really great pull factor. So we can always go to a real expert to get you more information. So that's kind of like just the stuff I thought was that I had to cover, so that you didn't think I was not up to date. But now we're going to get into some more fun stuff. So sensory experiences, of course, are very key to liking food and craving foods, and we're reaching some really interesting new places with virtual reality. This is a concept shot, and it's not something that is actually happening, but it does give you a sense of what you can do. And there are some early adopters in food service who are trying to use technology to create a more interesting sensory experience. The Wok-tail is a vessel that is controlled by an app. So a bartender, and this is in use in the U.S. in a couple of places. It's there's an app, and so the bartender would make you a drink, and then there are flavor emitters and olfactory sensors in the cup, and you can affect how it actually tastes and smells for yourself. So you and your friend could get the exact same drink, but have a very different experience. This concept over here is one that is more inclusive and definitely much further away from being a real thing. But the idea behind it is really interesting. What if you couldn't eat something because you had an allergy? What if you couldn't eat something because you were obese and it was very high fat? The idea here is that just like, in science fiction, you would be able to have an experience that was immersive, and you could basically, eat a wafer and get the sensory experience of eating the food that you'd really like to have. Has anyone here heard of gastrograph? This is really interesting. So they're taking big data and sensory to a really interesting new level. There are a couple of other companies that do this, and it's the ultimate narcissistic all about me eating experience. So the idea with gastrograph is that every time you have something, you record how it tasted, how it felt, what it smelled like, all of that kind of stuff. And eventually it starts to, using machine learning, understand and anticipate how your personal taste buds and olfactory system respond to things, and then they can start to respond by suggesting different foods to you. So it's at the point, theoretically, where you could be a chain restaurant, you could work with a farmer to develop what was the best tomato variety for your restaurant. And when you had those tomatoes in, you could then use your CRM system, your social media, to then ping the people who would find that to be their ideal tomato and say, hey, we've got them in. Come in for a burger today. Come in for pasta. So very interesting in the possibilities. And it reminds me, I started out in media, and my very first media job was, we heard all about how content was going to be curated and customized for us. And I was in my early 20s. So now fast forward, and we're complaining about how Facebook can target us and how we end up in these bubbles where we aren't getting a full set of opinions to consider. And I think we're kind of at that stage with this type of technology. So that took 30 years to happen. So if we're all alive in 30 years, let's promise to meet up and talk about how our customized spinach tasted last night. Exactly. For those of you who might not have heard the full question is, what's the commercial potential? And yes, it is definitely so that companies can sell more to people who have particular tastes. Yes, exactly. It's getting so granular about your likes and preferences that it goes beyond what you maybe can even perceive yourself and articulate. Because you might say, I don't like sweets, but your gastrograph could show that actually you don't like, caramelly sweets, but you do like citrusy sweets. So I'm sure that's where it's going. Yeah, I don't know if it's at that stage yet, but I'm sure that's exactly what the people who are developing it are hoping to have, is a way to, really crowdsource a lot of data that then, through machine learning, can make the most popular products. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So how is shopping, cooking going to change in the future? We've already seen vast changes. When I was working at Canadian Living back in the day, we were surprised when we did research in the very early 2000s that consumers thought cooking included buying a rotisserie chicken, buying bag salad, and buying salad dressing and combining them at home for dinner. And that kind of shattered us as recipe developers. Now, fast forward, and I think people think of cooking as just, microwaving something they picked up at Summerhill Market. It's changed even more so. 3D printers get a lot of hype. I've seen them in action in our food lab at the Guelph Food Innovation Center at the university. And to be honest, at this stage, they aren't really that effective for doing anything that would be practical. However, there was a pop-up called Food Inc., I-N-K, that did the rounds. It went to Barcelona, Seoul, and stopped in Toronto, and they 3D printed everything in this pop-up, the seats, the cutlery, and the food. So it will eventually get there. This was the first time this last Christmas that I heard of people actually buying 3D printers for their homes. So, again, go back to that first computer that turned up, if you're my generation, in your family's house, that Commodore 64. We're at the Commodore 64 stage with 3D printing. Really interesting. Do you guys know who Nathan Myhrvold is? Show of hands. Oh, yes, of course I know, So Nathan Myhrvold was one of the founders of Microsoft. He is just bonkers rich and does the coolest stuff. So one of the things he's really into is food. So if you've ever seen that group of 3 books, it weighs about 50 pounds, called Modernist Cuisine, that's his project. Go to the library and check them out. You don't necessarily have to buy them, but and follow him on Instagram, because he shows how he takes these pictures of food. And so he's a scientist who has lots of money and does a lot of really interesting things. He's also a prolific patenter. So I follow him to see what he's patenting, because it often gives me an idea of what's interesting him and where things are going. So I loved the Jetsons when I was a kid, especially this food replicator thing. So basically, Nathan has filed some patents that kind of suggest that he's working on something like this. And we've started to see things like pizza vending machines turning up, et cetera, and then the 3D printing. I think all of this kind of technology will come together. It'll probably be prohibitively expensive, but super fun and cool. Of course, the way we grow food is changing. Whole Foods has adopted a close relationship with Gotham Greens. I believe they're a Brooklyn company or a Queens company. And now the roofs of many Whole Foods have greenhouses on top, and they process the greens into clamshells and just take them downstairs and sell them and use those greens in the food service section at Whole Foods. So that's a great way to save food miles. This is a little unit called the Tiny Farm. This was one of my food starter clients back in the day, and he's progressed quite a ways. The concept isn't just to grow things in your house like you would with any kind of a grow light, but he's working on an app that will interface with you and your basically like your Fitbit and your health information. It'll say, oh, you're a little low on B vitamins. You should plant broccoli shoots, or you need X, or you need Y. He's also worked with Durham College, and I'm not sure what the real science behind this being necessary is, but he's also worked with Durham College to duplicate the soil that we had like 120 years ago, before the agricultural revolution, basically, so that it is back to being as clean and unadulterated as soil ever was. So quite interesting that you'd be able to not just grow greens in your own house, but grow specific things to your health needs. And I'm sure that something like that gastrograph could integrate with that technology. This Internet of Things will make a lot of new possibilities. So you'll find these guys at the show, I think. I certainly saw them walking yesterday. Back 40 Growers, they are a really interesting company. Actually, my colleague Vanya and I went to visit them, and I found it super inspiring. What they're doing is developing an uncoupled aquaculture system, which I'll explain a little bit more about why that's important in a minute. And they're growing all pollinated plants, so there's no insects. That means everything is just de facto kosher that comes out of their plant. And they're working with our university, they're working with the folks in Saskatchewan, and they are doing just some amazing advances in creating really energy efficient sensor systems to make this inside indoor, that's the word I'm going for, to make indoor plant growing more efficient. So they see aspirations for cities as well, and potentially having these in big buildings, as well as for the north, for deserts, for all kinds of places. And the reason that the uncoupled, I missed a slide. Sorry, no, I guess it didn't turn up. It's in my deck though. The reason that uncoupled aquaculture is desirable is that when you, aquaculture, just take a real step back, is where you have fish or aquatic animals growing in a tank. You use that water then, which is very nutrient dense, to then water plants, and you have basically a closed system. The problem with a traditional aquaponic system, which I have a sort of a diagram of, is that there's a lot of cross-contamination. And if you don't have extremely rigorous food safety and agriculture systems, you can have some microbial issues. And we've certainly all heard about lettuce and radishes and all these things that we can't buy for certain amounts of time because of that happening outdoors. So these guys have uncoupled it, which means that they do the fish in one section, then they take that water as well as the rainwater from the roof, and they make sure that it is completely clean and safe, and they test all the microbes, and then they use it in the plants. So it gives them a really added food safety assurance level that you couldn't get otherwise. If you've ever been to Asia and gone to a farm that grows shrimp or tilapia, you will know that this is very, very important. The chef experience, it's interesting because there's a shortage in the food service industry of talent. So many chefs will talk these days, particularly in cities like Toronto, about putting an ad out for cooks. They'll get 5 or 6 responses. They'll schedule interviews. One will turn up. They'll hire them, and then they don't actually turn up to do the work. So there's a lot of not just the novelty factor, but a lot of practical reasons why you might want to replace a cook with a robot. So Chef Daniel Balud, who has DB Bistro here in Toronto at the Four Seasons, he paired up with these young entrepreneurs, and in Boston, they created this place called Spice. And Spice is really interesting because it creates sort of like a Buddha bowl kind of experience. And you go in and you order, the robots make the dish. But what they found in testing, and this heartened me, was that the customer experience, if the bowl just came out and was there for people to pick up and go eat, it was the exact same food, but people said that it was less satisfying, less delicious when it was no people involved. So now they have 2 or 3 people who work there, depending on how busy they are, who take the bowl, garnish it with some sprigs, maybe some sesame seeds, and hand it to people. Their scores went way up. So that's nice that we still like the human touch, but we don't necessarily need to have humans to have a consistent, efficiently produced fast food product. Lots of money being spent from venture capitalists on all of these technologies that are some in the future and some in practice. In fact, the pictures that are on the right-hand side here are a few years old. They're taken in Seoul, Korea, in the subway system. So places with really densely populated and integrated store and people kind of neighborhoods have been doing this in London, in Seoul, and other cities where there's just a shopping wall. Instead of there being an ad, and it is an ad, but instead of there being an ad for shampoo or a movie in the subway, you can go scan, choose the items, and get this, by the time you get home, they're meeting you at the door. The delivery is that fast. And I thought it was pretty impressive at Christmas time when I ordered things from Amazon Saturday afternoon and they arrived Sunday afternoon. So this is a really, the potential of delivery and instant gratification in delivery is something that is just going to get faster and faster. Whether or not I want a drone delivering my pizza, I think my dog would go insane, is another thing. And of course, do we really want drones buzzing around and scaring the birds? Yeah. That picture was a subway car? No, it's on the platform. So while you're waiting for the subway, you do your shopping.
Oh, so the train's coming in behind.
Yeah, so can you see, like, he's standing on the other, the other side.
Because there's doors right there. Yeah.
I guess maybe it is a subway car.
That's the door. Those are
you know what? I think these are stationary, and then the train pulls in, and the doors open between it. Does that make sense? Did I articulate that?
I was going to say, moving bottles on a train.
Well, they are pictures. But yeah, no, I think they're stationary. And they're trying to do some, it also has that, there's a goal here in Toronto right now to try and make it less easy for people to fall on the tracks or be pushed on the tracks. So it has that safety factor going too. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's multifunctional. So safety is something that we're probably more focused on than ever before as consumers, and certainly people in this room who work in food manufacturing, I think about it a lot. You've heard of blockchain? Yes? No? Hands? Yeah. You're sick of hearing about blockchain? Yes? No? Blockchain is interesting in its application for the food value chain because it will take away a lot of duplication. So Aditi, who's down here in front, we used to work together at Kraft. She and I, just before we started, were talking about the job she has now, dealing with all kinds of regulatory, both in the US and Canada. So you have to wait for spec sheets. You have to make sure you got the right spec sheet. There's a lot of onus on people to handle paper at various levels of the value chain, and you don't always necessarily have all the info that you need the day you need it. I remember when I worked, my last corporate job was for a frozen food company, when we did a ton of work in private label for US companies. Trader Joe's was one of our clients, and we developed a Mexican hot cheese dip, a queso dip for Trader Joe's at their request. Trader Joe's, as you may or may not know, has pretty strict guidelines, and they want no ingredients with GMOs. So we hit it. They liked the taste. They liked the cost. Everything was right, except that their QA people were so focused on meeting this consumer promise to have no GMOs that they rejected our product because we couldn't get from Cargill, as you know, huge company, we couldn't get a spec sheet that said that the buffer that was used to keep the salt that we bought from them, from being easy flow and not clumping, was non-GMO. So I spent months and probably, tens of thousands of dollars, maybe over $100,000 developing a product that ultimately couldn't be sold. So blockchain would have helped me if we had this system. So the way blockchain works is that everybody goes into one ledger. So this is an online ledger in the cloud. You have a code for this product or this item, this ingredient, and all the information goes in one place. The flaw in blockchain is it assumes that everybody's putting in good information. And of course, that creates a whole other set of policing and standards and that kind of thing. This is a slide I adopted from a presentation by Dan Sinai from Microsoft. He is the person to talk to about this whole thing. I'm not, but this is sort of the layperson's version of blockchain. And I have a business friend. His name's Mike Lee. He runs the Future Market, which is an innovation company in New York City. He developed this as a mock-up product for the Fancy Food Show, and I think he's spot on. I think traceability can become a brand. So you'll see, and it's quite small, but you see how he's broken out all the info so that literally, like that Portlandia skit where the people ask all the questions about the chicken and they end up going to the farm to meet the farmer and the chicken's sisters, is exactly what he's getting at. But the depth of information that people want does seem to be fairly endless. Walmart has been doing some testing with blockchain, and the stat that I think is pretty amazing is that this was, I believe, mangoes that they did this. These stats came from. They did this study, and they discovered that they could track right back to where those mangoes were picked and grown in 13 seconds versus the 6 days it would cost of time and effort and media management to get back to the source of them. So you can see there is a big advantage. If all of the information is accurate and validated, it is there for you when you need it. Problem with big companies like Walmart getting involved in blockchain is that it means that all their suppliers, if they want to do business with them, will also have to become involved. And that will mean changing systems, buying new types of computer programs, retraining people. And my fear is that the small and medium-sized businesses will not be able to respond to this as quickly as big businesses. And DNA barcoding. So a lot of people are saying, okay, blockchain is this platform, but what are the tools in the toolbox that will help us to verify things? So we have the Center for Biodiversity on campus at the University of Guelph, and we have a lot of really smart people doing really interesting things. One of them is Life Scanner, and one of their main people, her name is Megan. She did a study with her lunch where over a course of months, every time she had sushi or a fish burger, she took a sample of it and used her own kit to test it. And well over 40% of the time, the fish that she was told was in her lunch was not the same fish. It wasn't a bad fish, but it just wasn't properly labeled. So having your QA department use things like DNA barcoding, this is quite inexpensive. Even Life Scanner, their kits for like kids to use and for home use and hobby use are like 3 vials for $40. And certainly I'm sure these types of things rolled out on a wholesale commercial level would be much cheaper. Telling your suppliers that you're going to be checking the DNA of the items that they send you is a really great way to be able to verify that your suppliers know what they're getting. Chef Martin Coupry, who, full disclosure, is my husband, but also one of the early adopters of the OceanWise program and is on their advisory board. He operated a restaurant in the location that Plant is in now for 20 years, and he has a very sensitive palate. So his fish suppliers, and tell me if I'm getting this right, Hun, that they would sometimes bring you fish and say, taste this and tell me how old it is. Tell me if this is this fish or that fish. Yeah, so even people who are selling fish have doubt about what they're getting from the boat. And once a fish is cut and it doesn't have its head and its fins on, it's not as easy to tell sometimes what it is. The other interesting technology that is coming out of our campus is using isotope mapping to identify where something can be a fish, can be a grown crop, can be an animal product, that where it's actually from. So if you get wild-caught Atlantic salmon, you know that if it was caught off Alaska or British Columbia, that the industry there is using sustainable techniques. However, if it's coming from Russia, you don't know that. And they could be using all kinds of unsustainable harvesting practices. So interestingly, I learned this from our researchers on campus. All this isotope mapping has been done years and years and years ago for geographic purposes, soil purposes, etc. And so this is a technology that exists and just now is getting this overlay of food fraud applied to it. So quite interesting and definitely a great way for people who are extremely concerned about the ethical and sustainability aspects of certain foods. And the purity of soil. Like, I mean, do you want to buy turnips from Chernobyl? Not so much, right? So it's... So I'm going to finish up just talking to you about a few things that are on my radar screen that are popping up and becoming more promising and more interesting and more talked about. Crispr. Who here has not heard of Crispr? Cool. Excellent. So we all know that GMO is genetically modified organisms. CRISPR is a gene editing system, and there was an amazing article. In fact, I took this graphic from the article. If you Google National Geographic and CRISPR, you will get to this article. And as you know, National Geographic is always such a credible source. So the idea behind CRISPR is that it allows you to take out unbeneficial characteristics of a plant, of an animal. There's a controversial case in the news right now about apparently some scientists in China who took the liberty of going against what the world's ethics leaders recommend, and they used CRISPR on the DNAs of some twins who had apparently a family risk of having a particular disease. That is definitely an extreme case, but these apples are in market now. And basically, you can see this apple is not browned. that apple is browned. All they did was take out the gene that causes apples to brown. So there's a lot of promising things that they can do using CRISPR and applying that type of knowledge to the food system. The coffee one is really interesting. If you ever order decaf after dinner, you know that sometimes it's just not the same as your regular cup of joe. And that's because the decaffeination process changes the flavor. But if they could change some of the plants in the coffee grove so that some of them just didn't produce caffeine, apparently they could avoid that problem. So if this interests you, I highly recommend this National Geographic article. It took a whole bunch of things I'd heard, re-explained them, and then added a lot more. Farming in space. This is Professor Mike Dixon. He is a pretty cool guy. He is working on, and the headlines always talk about growing food on Mars, but the application of his technology, which is using different types of light and creating chambers that give consistent and appropriate conditions for growing crops, can work in the Arctic, in the desert, and in any contained space. And really, really interesting guy. He's often on shows like Quirks and Quarks and things like that. And his work is well respected and kind of leading the charge. Another person working in this space is Dr. Karen Koontz. She's apparently a Toronto person, but she works in Israel, and she's taking a different route to this type of info. And if I got my 5 minutes, what she's trying to do is figure out, when you use a system like Dr. Dixon's, what's the most efficient thing to produce? And if you're in space, would it be easier, cheaper, more sustainable to make beer or grow weed? Apparently it's weed. So Canadians are in training for Mars, I guess. So battling food waste, just going to go through this really quickly. There's tons of great opportunities with technology to help battle food waste. Dr. Dan Gillis developed an app, and he's one of our computer scientists at Guelph. And basically, when you're in the grocery store, you can use this app to see what your local food bank needs. So if they need baby formula, you'll know. If they need peanut butter, you'll know. And so simple, could be scaled very, very quickly and easily. This is the grandfather of the circular food waste movement, Massimo Bottura. He often comes to Toronto. He has an excellent relationship with George Brown College. I've seen him speak there myself. He is awesome in person. So if you get a chance to see him, do go. He's a great storyteller. And he has a Michelin-starred restaurant just outside of Milan. He is often in the top 3 of those San Pellegrino World's Best Restaurant Awards. So no slouch, highly respected. And when they had the expo in Milan a few years ago, he created this place called Commissary, where they took all the waste from the expo, the food waste, and they turned it into meals. And it was a pay-what-you-can place. So they had, people like us in there paying $5 or $10 for something, an appropriate market price. And then they had local people from Milan who couldn't afford to go to a restaurant, and they were eating as well. And what he's done has been the impetus for a lot of other programs that are sprouting out in all kinds of urban places. Guelph is hoping to create a circular food economy. If you're in my last panel discussion, I recommended that if you want to learn more about this whole idea of how you upcycle and repurpose all kinds of things in the food value chain, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I believe they're in Scotland, their website, I learned a ton. Also, the City of Guelph's website has a lot of information about this right now, because they're going for a $10 million federal grant to implement this kind of a system in Guelph. So these are all things that I think will become a little bit more sort of common, maybe food manufacturing lunch break room conversations, if not dinner party conversations. And she said we only had 5 minutes, but I think we can still do a question or two if there are any. All right, well, thank you so much, guys, for coming. I hope this was a good use of your time.